Good morning. Let's start. So I'm running the application using ng-serve-o. So yesterday we got acquainted with a little bit about Angular and how to create components, how to bootstrap, and what are modules, and how to bootstrap module, component, and everything. So today we'll try to learn few more concepts such as templates. Go to app or any other component, that home component. So these components can be nested. You can write one component inside another component. You can consume pretty much. So here the template is a single line template. If I want to add another line, I need to concatenate it to use something like this. Say second heading. And if I want to another line, add another line, I need to do the same thing like this. And this is, as you might have already guessed it, this is going to be painful because this concatenation is ugly and there is no help from the IDE. You need to have this plus in every time. So if you have, say, 15 or 20 lines of code, this becomes really hard to maintain. So single line templates work only when you have a single line. That makes more sense when you have only one single line and you want to just use this single line, single quotes or double quotes. Anything is fine. But again, when you are dealing with multiple lines of code, rather than adding these concatenated strings, what you can do is you can use backtick. So backtick is a key which is underneath the escape key on the keyboard. So you can use backtick and pretty much you can write multiple lines. And these are called multi-line strings. No concatenation needed. And you can pretty much add as many lines as you want like this. So the application is running. It takes for the first time slow and my machine is even slower. So it's going to take some time. Just give it a time before we check this out. Meanwhile, we'll see the third type of template. The way you can create is a separate file. So you don't like this multi-line strings, you can wrap it inside a separate file. Let's go ahead and create one, say about .component.html. And here you can say about page like this and go to about component, get rid of everything. Now instead of saying template, you'll say template URL because you are pointing to a file. And you'll say about .component.html, name of file. And this is how you separate your HTML in a separate file. So this is always a good approach because you are isolating HTML from your TypeScript code. It doesn't mean that this is not a good approach because if you have less than 10 lines of code, probably you can go with multi-line strings. If you have more than 10 lines of code, it's a good idea that you wrap everything inside a file rather than keeping it there. So it depends. And companies have some code of conduct, like projects, teams have code of conduct. Even though you have two lines of code, they want to keep it in a separate file. So you check out with your project how they want to proceed. Usually, companies would like to put everything inside a separate file, even there is one line of code, and that's for consistency they follow. Or maybe even if you have more than 10 lines of code, some projects may go wanna go with this multi-line strings. The advantage of having a separate file is you're getting this nice color encoding, and you'll get some like IntelliSense, if you notice here. And this nice little feature you would be missing out here. You won't get those benefits here. Yes, CSS stylings will see that. Yes, you can write your CSS styles here as well. It supports, but it supports in a different way. You'll say styles and you'll wrap your styles here. Something like background color, red, or something like this. We'll see that how to achieve that. You can even wrap all the styles inside a separate file, but again later we'll see. Okay, I don't know why this is taking a lot of time. Let's retry. Okay, finally it's doing something. Let's wait a couple of more minutes. Yeah. This is multi-line strings, and if you want to check out how the separate file looks like, you'll consume app about component. So the selector convention is usually app slash app hyphen and name of the component. And usually companies go with their company prefix. So if you like company name or project name, they would like to go with, rather than just saying home, they say some company name. Say you have IBM, you'll say IBM hyphen or home, something like that. The reason is if it is not company name, it can be your project name also. The reason is in future version of HTML, this home tag may be added. So if this is colliding with the HTML tag, probably your component may not work properly. So it's always a good idea that you have some prefix while naming your components. Try to make them unique so that they won't interfere with the HTML, existing HTML elements, or maybe in future elements like this about page. So this is coming from a separate file altogether. So that's a little bit about the templates. As I said, single line strings are not going to help you a lot, but multi-line strings are better. And always this separate file is always a good option because you're getting some support from the IDE also. Throughout this course, I would be using this multi-line strings because I don't want to switch between the files to show you, so that I can show you pretty much everything here. So I'll use this, but it doesn't mean that you should also use the same thing. So it depends on your project guidelines. Okay. So the next topic we'll jump into is data binding. So Angular supports wide varieties of ways that you can bind the data, as many as 6 ways. One is expression, or you can call it interpolation. Then we have property binding, event binding, class, style, and two-way binding. There are 6 ways that you can bind the data. So what do you mean by data binding? Data binding is nothing. You get the data from some source. Maybe it is a web service or file or somewhere else. And you want to bind it to HTML elements. When you bind it to HTML elements, that's when user will able to see them. So rather than just throwing at him the data, the data may be in XML format or JSON format, your end user may not be a techie and he may not understand what that means. So you present it in a nice way, maybe binding it to the radio buttons or checkboxes or somewhere. So data binding is really crucial in application because most of the applications are data driven application. So we'll see how can we bind the data. There are simple ways that you can bind using expression. So expression, you wrap an expression inside curly brace, and expression is nothing but JavaScript code snippets. So 1 plus 2, what you see is 3. So this expression would be taken and evaluated because you have wrapped inside double curly brace like this. You have 3. So this expression need not necessarily be a literal string. It can go inside somewhere here, inside a heading tag. Now what you're doing is you're binding this h1 element with this expression like this. And it doesn't necessarily has to be a number always. It can be anything, something like this, a string. So these are JavaScript code snippets. If you want to evaluate something, you can do it. And it doesn't necessarily has to be a hard-coded string or a expression always. It can be a property on the class. So for the first time, I'll create one property on my component class. I'll name it, say, my property, which is going to be of type string, and I'll assign some value, something like this. If I want to take this data and show it as a heading, I need to use binding. That is expression. I'll say my property h1. So this my property is not a string. It is a property. So it would be evaluated here. So these properties are public in the template. They are visible. Even if you make this property as private, So basically your template is part of your class, this class. So even if this member is private, still your template would be able to access that property. Let's go ahead and check this out. See, so I'm binding this property here. Okay. This expression, you can even call some functions. It doesn't necessarily has to be a property always. So I'll create one function, say private, I'll say get it, which returns string value. I'll say from method or whatever it is. Here, I'll bind it to h2 tag and I'll say expression get. I'll invoke the function from there and whatever is returned would be bound to this expression. See, like that. So these are the couple of ways that you can bind data using expression. So a couple of things that you should note is this function has to be very lightweight. So the reason is you're calling this function from the view. If it is taking a lot of time to load, so your view rendering would be slower. So this function, if you're calling it from view, it has to be side effect free. What do I mean by no side effects? Side effects is something where you modify the state of a class or an object. So this function essentially has to be kind of a read only or only for reading something, not for writing or modifying the state. Because you're going to I don't know how many times you're going to render it. It depends on your requirement. So in that case, it's going to modify the state if you have written something inside this function. So make sure that this function doesn't have side effects and it has to be really fast. Otherwise, you will notice a degraded performance at the time of rendering the view. So these are, as I said, JavaScript code snippets. It doesn't mean that you can write whatever you want, the JavaScript code. I cannot say if do something or something like that. This is not valid. I cannot write if conditions, switch conditions, or for loops, or some whatever, like creating a functions and all those things. Rather, what is allowed is a ternary operator. So I'll say my property. Okay, if my property is defined, I'm saying yes, else no. Something like this. This is perfectly allowed. A ternary operator is allowed, even though the conditional statements are not allowed, such as if and switch. So it says yes. So remember, go back to again, probably we have discussed this already a couple of times, the truthy and falsy values. Here it's important. So my property, if defined means if it is true or truthy, it has some value. So that's why you're getting yes as the output. And if it is not defined or if it is an empty string, you would see no, like this. One more time, let me remind you what are falsy values. It's empty string, false, zero, not a number, undefined, null. So these are the 6 values which are false. One, two, three, four, five, six. Yes, falsy values. Other than these, all are truthy. Okay, that's about expressions. One more time, let me summarize. You can write some JavaScript code snippets. Ternary operator is allowed. If and switch case statements are not allowed. Functions are not allowed inside expression. You can bind a property. You can even bind a function. And the return type of that function uh, would be bound to that element, whatever it is. Any questions on that expressions? Okay, so the question is, how am I able to access my property from the template? So that's the magic of component decorator. So decorator has some code, and that code actually injects into this home component. So your template is also part of your component class. So that's why it is able to access it, even if it is private. So that's how the component decorator works. So your decorator takes this template and takes this selector and makes it part of this component class. So anything part of this class, you will still be able to access it from this class. Such as this get method, you can access it from another method. You can say this dot get, you have an access. The same way, this template is also part of same class. Don't think it is outside of this class. So that's the only reason why you are able to access all the properties and functions. Okay, let's go ahead and see what is property binding. So you have some properties in HTML tags. Let me clear this up, such as disabled. Disabled is HTML property and there is nothing specific to Angular going on here. I'll say click. A simple button I've created and I'm saying disabled true. It is disabled. The button is disabled. So if you want to assign or bind this disabled property uh, to this property value based on if it is truthy, this should be disabled. If it is falsy, this should be enabled. In that case, property binding comes into picture. So you're taking HTML property and you're binding it with the some value. So in that case, you will wrap this property inside square brackets and value of the property. Save this. See, now it is clickable. The reason is it's falsy. You're saying disabled equals to false. If you have some value, that would be truthy. Disabled it becomes true. Now it is disabled. So you can bind pretty much any property of HTML. You'll say input type text. Now I want to bind the value property. You'll say value, my property. Save this and see what happens. It is actually binding my property. The reason is unless you wrap it inside brackets, it won't be evaluated. So wrap it inside square brackets. So now you have hello Angular. That is nothing but the value of this property like this. So pretty much any property you can bind it, checkbox or input type text boxes or whatever you want. So that's property binding. And the same way you can even call a method from your property binding. You can call a method. Again, the same rules apply here, no side effects, and it has to be fast. And you can have a ternary operator as well. So if you want to bind something conditionally, you can have your ternary operator here. Yeah, true or false, something like that. So now I'm saying, okay, if the value is written truthy, so say the disabled is true, otherwise false, something like that. This is just an example. You don't need to do it in this case here. Anyhow, it is evaluated to true or false. So that's property binding, and we'll see event binding. Before seeing that event binding, understand the flow of the binding here. So let me open Paint. This is important. So assume that we have our template here, and we have our component class. So the flow of, even though both are part of same class, now I'm just kind of isolating just for explanation. So the expression and your property binding are in this direction. I'm sorry, this is the wrong way. They are the other way around. What are these? Your expressions and property binding. They are from component class to template. So the data flow is class to template. Now we'll see event binding. So assume that user clicked on this button. So I'll create another button, say button 2. Let's look, let's have a look how this looks like. Nothing specific to Angular going on here yet, just a button. And when you click on this, something should happen, whatever it could be. So I'll open developer tools F12. So my requirement is when I click on this button, some message should be given inside console. So in that case, event binding comes into picture. So you will create a function first, say on click or something like that. And this is user defined name. It can be anything. So I'm just saying on click. I'll just say console.log button clicked. Save this. And this on click function should be invoked whenever this button is clicked. So I'll say on click. Okay. Simple. You wrap it inside parenthesis, the click event, and the parenthesis signifies that it is a event binding and name of the function that is to be invoked whenever the button is clicked. So save this, go back to the browser, click on this button, and you have this button click. So this binding is event binding and it is the other way around. The flow is from template to class. The data flow is important. You should understand this. It is from template to component class. That's how the flow is, the data flow is. Okay. Now, if you want to pass some parameters to this onClick function, you can do it. Say some parameter you're passing a value at 10, and here you can cache the value param, and definitely I'm going to just log it. So click on this, and we have it here like this. So that's event binding, parenthesis and brackets. Brackets for property binding and parenthesis for event binding. Now let's go ahead and see the next binding, class and style. Okay, so I have a homepage heading here, and I want to apply some classes on this h1 tag. You can pretty much apply using simple HTML, something like this. You say class, say color red or something like that. So this class doesn't exist. So go to our project's directory structure, and somewhere you should have styles.css. These are global styles. So for application level, application wide, if you want to apply some styles, you would put it here. So what are the other styles other than global? You will have component specific styles. So only styles for only this component you can apply. At this moment, I'll go with this global styles, but we'll see later how to apply specific styles to specific components. So I'll create a red class here, and I'm going to say color of this class is going to be red. Excuse me. And that class is applied inside HTML, and you'll have red. But I want to apply this class conditionally. So in that case, again, class binding comes into picture. So you'll wrap this class inside brackets and name of the class, and you will say property. Okay, this looks like a lot of code here, but it's simple. Class is class attribute or property, and I'm saying apply red class if this my property is truthy. Otherwise, don't. That's what it means. Conditionally applying, and this is what your class binding is. If you see, notice here closely, it's nothing but a flavor of property binding. Come back here, and this class is applied because my property is truthy. I'm going to get rid of this hello angular, so it becomes falsy, and now that class should not be applied like this. So that's class binding. And the same way we have style binding. Once come back to paint, and the direction is also again same class to template, except event binding. Remaining all bindings are class to template, the data flow. Now go back and see how you can apply inline styles to another HTML. I'll say H1, say heading or something like that. So if you want to apply some styles, say style, background color or border or whatever it is. Say let's apply border. I'll say 1px solid black. So this is the border that I'm applying using style attribute of HTML. Save this and nothing specific to Angular here. A border is applied. But if I want to conditionally apply that, and that's when the style binding comes into picture. You wrap it inside brackets and you'll say which property you want to bind it. You'll say style.border and you want to conditionally apply. You'll say my property is true. You'll say in the single quotes because it's a value. Otherwise, you'll say none. So you're saying, okay, my property is truthy, apply border. If not, don't apply. So come back here. The border should go away because my property doesn't have any value. If you have some value here, and that should apply the border like that. So the color red appeared and the border has also been shown. So that's class and style binding. And finally, we'll see one more binding, which is two-way binding. As the name suggests, it's two-way. And all the bindings so far, whatever we have seen, are one-way binding. Two-way binding is from template to component class and component class to template. And let's see how that works. So I'm going to create one text box. I believe I already have one here. And I'm going to have h3 tag here and bind it to my property. Okay. In summary, I have one text box which has binding of my property, and I have a heading tag which has a property, which has my property binding. Both are actually bound to the same property. Come back and you modify something here, and nothing is changing here. This property is still holding the value, old value, because this is one-way binding. Once it is bound, and there won't be any updates to it. So if I want, whenever I modify something here, I want the data to be in sync. So in that case, two-way binding comes into picture. So rather than going with value here, you'll say ng model. Let's see if that works. So ng model is a directive. We haven't discussed directives yet. We'll discuss them tomorrow. And if you notice here, I have brackets and I have parenthesis, which means it's two-way binding. For parenthesis, event binding. For property, for brackets, you have property binding. So when you are using both of them, it means you are using two-way binding. So let's go ahead and check this out. You have an error. It says ng model is not a known element. So your Angular application is not able to find out what is ng model. So Angular team has decided to put this ng model inside a separate module. And we don't have that module imported. That's why you're seeing that error. So go back to app.module.ts file and try to import that module. That module is nothing but forms module. Let's import it. And it is part of forms library. I'll add an import statement. Here it is. Now there are no errors in the console. See, now the data is in sync always. So that's two-way binding. Wherever the data is changing, the data would be always in sync. Maybe the data is changing in the template or in the class, irrespective of the location of the change, the data is always in sync. So you change the data in the component class, the changes would reflect here. You change in the view, changes would be always in sync. That's what two-way binding, and ng model is a directive which allows you to again bind the data in two ways. That's ng model. What's the reason why this is put inside forms module is because you are most likely to use ng model only when you're dealing with forms, when you're collecting the data from the user. So that's why the Angular team has put it inside a separate module altogether rather than putting inside core module. Okay, any questions on this? These six types of bindings. Yes. So the question is, can you summarize the entire flow once? Yes. So probably you're talking about all the bindings. Let's go ahead and see. So expressions are nothing but again interpolation. It takes your string and try to evaluate that as an expression. And that is one way from component class to template. You can pretty much put your JavaScript code snippets, or you can bind a property, a function. And the same thing, property binding. You take HTML property, and this property is not Angular property, it's HTML property. So it's already existing in the HTML, and you wrap it inside square brackets, and that's when the value, whatever you assign, would be evaluated. That's property binding. You can bind a function, you can bind a property, you can have a ternary operator here as well, just like you had in interpolation. And the event binding is the reverse binding, you can call it. It is not from component class to view, rather view to class. So like user performing some operation, like clicking a button or uh, changing a drop down list value or something like that. And that's event binding. Here, event binding accepts a function as a parameter. So you can pass some parameters to that function, as many as you want, but the input to this event binding is going to be a function, and you wrap the event inside parentheses. And then you have class binding. It's just a flavor of your property binding. This is also one way. You will say some class name and you evaluate it with a parameter, I mean property. And the same way you have style binding. You want to apply inline styles based on some condition. We have seen border. It doesn't necessarily has to be a border. It can be any CSS style. Background color, you have border, and your box layout or whatever it is. It can be pretty much any CSS style. And then we have seen two-way binding, where we have used an inbuilt ng model directive for two-way binding, which binds the data in two ways. It's nothing but combination of property binding and event binding. Property binding is from class to view, and event binding is view to class. So the combination of these two bindings is two-way binding. And whenever you want the data to be always in sync, you use two-way binding. You hardly use two-way binding except in forms. In the forms, we need to have that two-way binding. I'll show you. I'll talk about that when we are dealing with forms. Okay, does that make everything clear or still any questions? So as we have few more minutes, let's jump into another topic, which is directives. We'll see some of the inbuilt directives. I'm going to push these. Okay, I think I've pushed all the changes. Let's clean this up. Okay. I have one heading and I'll clean this event component class also. Even if I'm cleaning here, you can still find it in my commits on GitHub. Okay. So simple component. Now, if you want to conditionally show or hide this element, how can you do that? And that's when some directives comes into picture. We'll see few directives such as if, or you can say ng if, ng for, we have ng switch, then ng model we have just seen. And am I missing something? We have ng class and ng style. So these are the few directives that are available. And if you have any experience of Angular 1, you have a bunch of directives there. But here you have like as many as only 9 or 10 directives available uh, in Angular 2 onwards, because most of the directives which were redundant were removed. There is no ng show, ng hide directives in Angular 2, where you had them in Angular 1. You have ng show and ng hide. Ng pretty much can do that. So Angular team has decided those redundant directives. So it's actually a good thing because you don't need to remember a lot of directives. There are very few directives, and we'll see some of them. So ng if, based on a condition, you can show or hide an element. So this asterisk symbol is needed, and name of the directive is ng if. We'll talk about that. What is that asterisk in a minute? Let's see. I'm saying ng if true. So this home page heading should be shown. So you are noticing this one. And when I say false, this should go away. Okay, that heading is no more shown. You can have a property to do the same thing rather than hard coding it. You'll say show. The property has true. So it should show up the heading. If it is false, again, as you might have expected, it would hide the element. One important thing to note here is when the heading is hidden, click on inspect. See, that heading is nowhere shown. You have app home, but there is no h1 tag shown here. And when I make it true, that tag would come up. See? And now you have that heading here. So that's what ngIf does. It actually removes the element from the DOM completely. It removes, and if the expression is evaluated to true, it would add the element to the DOM. So that's important thing, and sometimes it improves the performance because you are removing. If you have a huge HTML that you want to say, you have a div, and this div has lot of tags inside it. Assume that too many things. So if this ngIf is evaluated to false, Angular doesn't need to render them. It can just simply skip those elements. So that actually improves the performance. Say this. Okay. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it always improves the performance. So sometimes it does, but in some cases where you have a button and you're toggling the view multiple times, say button, I'm going to have a click event on top of this button. I'll say toggle, which shows and hides the element. I'll say toggle. So I've created a button with a click event on it, or with the help of event binding. So I'll create this toggle function here, which returns nothing. You can say void, or you can just ignore this one. Anything is fine. When you say this, you can return something or any type. But I'll be more explicit and say void. It does return nothing. Here I'm going to toggle the value of show and hide. I'll say if show, this is instance property, so you need to append it this. I'll say this dot show is true. I'll say this dot show equals to false. else I'll set it to true. Okay, I'm not doing anything other than just changing the value to true to false, false to true. That's it. So assume that, and this is your requirement, and the user may do it this 100 times, toggling it and showing it and hiding it. In this case, it may actually degrade the performance. The reason is it is going to add the DOM every time. So ng if actually removes and adds the element. When you go to body, app root, app home, notice here you don't have, okay, you have that div home page. When I toggle it, that div is gone. It's not available anymore. When I toggle it again, it comes up. So in this case, if you're toggling it multiple times, a huge div may degrade the performance. So ng if, it's up to you as a developer, you have to make a choice. Which one is better, ng if it is better or not. So what's the um, alternative for this? If you don't want to use ng if, what's the alternative? You can use property binding. You have something like hidden attribute inside HTML. You can use hidden. So the difference between hidden and ng if is hidden doesn't remove the element from the DOM. You have app home, you have this div. It's it's there, even though it's not showing up here. It's there. You toggle it. See, the DOM is actually not modified, except that only the hidden attribute is added. That's it, like this. So that's hidden and ngif. Ngif is a structural directive which modifies the structure of the DOM. And every structural directive will have this asterisk symbol prefix. Okay. The next directive we'll see is ng switch. So ng if the condition is true, you show something or hide something. But if you want to check multiple conditions based on a value, this ng the show property may have more than one value. In that case, you may want to show different elements. So in that case, I'm going to say div ng switch. I'll say some property, say priority or something like that. It's a string, and I'm going to say high priority. Assume that a task has high priority. So based on this, you want to toggle or show or hide some elements. So I'm going to bind this to ng switch. Ng switch is not a structural directive because there is no asterisk symbol there. And I want to show h1 ng switch case if it is high. Okay. So if this is confusing you, just this compare this with switch case statement. You'll have a switch on some property, and you'll have some cases, case high, and you'll have a break, and then you'll have case low and something like that. So ng switch directive is also similar to switch case statement in programming languages. So I'm saying, okay, priority has a value of high, show this element. If not, show the other element, something like that. So let's see if this works. See, high priority task is shown. I'll change the value to low, and it should show up low priority task. When you analyze the DOM, you'll have only one H1. You have this div, This is parent div. That's where I bound this one ng switch, and the remaining divs or remaining H1 elements are being removed. That's why it is asterisk. So this ng switch case is structural. This is going to modify the structure of the DOM. So that's why asterisk, and this won't modify it. So that's why property binding like that. So interesting thing here, what if I give a value which doesn't exist here? So the condition doesn't exist. It nothing would show up here because no condition matches, nothing would show. So just like you have default case inside a switch case statement, you can have default here. You'll say ng switch default. You'll say very low priority, something like this. Any value which doesn't match these three values would come here like this. So that's ng switch. So tomorrow we'll see ng for and ng class and ng style. So we'll stop here and I'll summarize quickly whatever we have discussed. We have discussed about templates. There are three types of templates: inline, multi-line, and a separate file. And then we jumped into data binding. So there are 6 ways that you can bind the data. All of them, 5 of them are one-way binding, and the remaining one is two-way binding. And then we have seen this ng if and ng switch directives. And ng if is a structural directive, while ng switch is not. It's attribute directive. This is called attribute directive. While ng switch case is also a directive, which is structural directive. So you can create your own structural directive and attribute directives, but we'll see in the end of this course how can we write our own. At this moment, we are learning the inbuilt. We have a couple of more minutes. You guys have any questions?